Some serial killers are remembered for the brutality of their crimes. Others are known for the sheer number of lives they claimed. But one killer became infamous for a different reason. For nearly 2 decades, he managed to hide in plain sight, living among ordinary people without anyone realizing who he truly was. In 1982, young women began disappearing one after another across the Seattle metropolitan area in Washington state. Days or even weeks later, some of them were found dead. Many of their bodies were discovered near the Green River, while others were scattered across wooded areas near Kent, ravines, hillsides, and isolated patches of brush along nearby waterways. At first, investigators believed they were dealing with only 3 victims. But as the weeks passed, the number continued to grow. 5 victims, 10 victims. Then dozens more were recovered from different locations throughout King County. Authorities gradually realized these deaths were not isolated incidents. They were likely hunting a serial killer. The investigation revealed a disturbing pattern. Most of the victims had been sexually assaulted before being strangled to death. In the early stages of the case, many were identified as sex workers who operated along Pacific Highway South or in local brothels. But as more victims were identified, that pattern became less defined. Some were women struggling with drug addiction. Others were living in poverty. Some were teenage runaways who had fled abusive homes or difficult family situations. Despite their different backgrounds, investigators eventually recognized one striking similarity. Every victim had been living in circumstances that made them especially vulnerable. And without realizing it, that vulnerability appeared to be exactly what the killer was looking for. The first victim to be identified was 16-year-old Wendy Lee Caulfield. Her body was discovered on the 15th of July, 1982. Wendy had grown up in a troubled home and had run away several times before eventually ending up on the streets. In the weeks before her death, she was frequently seen along Pacific Highway South, a corridor that had become well known as the center of street prostitution in the Seattle metropolitan area. There, she turned to sex work as a means of survival. Her body was discovered by a man fishing in the Green River. From a distance, he assumed the object tangled among the dry branches along the riverbank was nothing more than a discarded mannequin. But as he moved closer, he realized he was looking at the naked body of a young woman. He immediately contacted the police. Several weeks later, on the 12th of August, 1982, investigators identified the second victim. She was 23-year-old Deborah Lynn Bonner, remembered by her family as a warm and friendly person. But as an adult, she developed a drug addiction that gradually destabilized her life. To support herself, she eventually began working as a sex worker along Pacific Highway South. Just 3 days later, on August 15, investigators identified a third victim. She was 31-year-old Marcia Faye Chapman, a mother of 3. After her divorce, Marcia struggled with financial hardship and substance abuse. Facing few options, she also turned to sex work along Pacific Highway South. Despite the difficulties in her life, those who knew her said she always tried to remain close to her 3 children. But Marcia would not be the last victim. That same day, investigators discovered the bodies of 2 more women at separate locations near the Green River. The discoveries were coming too quickly to ignore. Investigators began to suspect they were no longer dealing with a series of unrelated murders. Instead, the evidence pointed to a single offender who was systematically selecting, killing, and disposing of his victims. That suspicion only grew stronger as more bodies were recovered over the following weeks and months. What had begun as a handful of unexplained deaths soon became one of the largest serial murder investigations in American history. The case would eventually become known as the Green River Killer Investigation. At the time, however, no one truly understood why women from such different walks of life were all meeting the same tragic fate. Around this time, a truck painter named Gary Ridgway began drawing the attention of investigators. Several witnesses reported seeing Gary with young women inside his pickup truck under circumstances they considered suspicious. Detectives brought him in for questioning. He agreed to take a polygraph examination, provided hair samples, and submitted saliva samples as part of the investigation. But forensic technology in the early 1980s was still limited. With little physical evidence connecting him to the murders, investigators had no legal grounds to keep him in custody. Gary was released and returned to his everyday life. Meanwhile, the list of victims continued to grow. On the 15th of September 1982, 18-year-old Mary Bridget Meehan disappeared without a trace. Mary had enjoyed a relatively happy childhood and was remembered as a friendly and outgoing young woman. But during her teenage years, her life began to unravel. She frequently got in trouble at school, skipped classes, eventually ran away from home, and moved in with her boyfriend. She was last seen in SeaTac, Washington. That day, Mary left a motel and set out alone on foot. She was never seen again. Early in the investigation, suspicion briefly fell on her boyfriend. But after looking into his whereabouts and examining the available evidence, detectives found nothing linking him to Mary's disappearance. As investigators compared her case with the others, the similarities became difficult to ignore. They began to suspect that Mary had become another victim of the same unidentified killer. By the end of 1982, 7 women had been confirmed as victims in what would later become known as the Green River Killer case. Mary, however, remained missing. It wasn't until 1983 that her body was discovered in a shallow grave near Kent. Because her remains had been buried for an extended period, investigators were unable to determine her exact cause of death. What they did discover was equally heartbreaking. Mary was approximately 8 months pregnant when she was killed. On the 30th of April 1983, a young woman named Marie Malvar mysteriously disappeared. Marie worked as a sex worker along Pacific Highway South. Shortly before she vanished, witnesses saw her arguing with a man on the side of the road. A short time later, she climbed into a pickup truck and drove away with him. Her pimp and her boyfriend, Robert Woods, tried to follow the vehicle, but the truck sped away, disappearing through an intersection before they could catch up. A few days later, Woods reported Marie missing. Using his statement and the description of the pickup truck, investigators were able to trace the vehicle to a modest home. The house belonged to a man who worked as a commercial truck painter. His name was Gary Ridgway. For the second time, Gary became a person of interest in the investigation. Detectives brought him in for another round of questioning. He was interviewed, examined, and asked to undergo another polygraph test. But once again, investigators found no evidence directly linking him to Marie's disappearance or to the growing series of murders. The polygraph results also failed to provide any convincing indication that he was being deceptive. Without enough evidence to bring charges against him, investigators had no choice but to let Gary walk free once again. Although Gary Ridgway had once again been released, young women across the Seattle metropolitan area continued to disappear. As the winter of 1984 approached, more bodies were discovered near the Green River and in other remote locations. Whenever investigators were able to examine the remains, they found the same disturbing pattern. Most of the victims had been sexually assaulted before being killed, and their bodies were abandoned in isolated places where they were unlikely to be found. One of the victims recovered during this period was Lori Ann Razib. Her skeletal remains were discovered hidden in thick brush. Because her body had been exposed to the elements for so long, much of the forensic evidence had been lost, leaving investigators with few new leads. The number of victims continued to rise. On the 20th of September, 1985, 15-year-old Deborah Lauren Estes disappeared after running away from an abusive home. She was never seen again. As the investigation remained unsolved, it eventually drew the attention of the federal government. In June 1986, the FBI joined local law enforcement in what had become one of the largest serial murder investigations in the country. By then, dozens of young women had been reported missing throughout the Seattle metropolitan area. Many of them were later found near the Green River, while others were recovered from wooded areas, ravines, valleys, and other remote locations. As the victim count grew, investigators realized the killer's dumping grounds extended far beyond what they had originally believed. The search expanded accordingly. Hundreds of volunteers joined the effort, including members of the Explorer Scouts, helping search forests, hillsides, and riverbanks. For many of them, the mission was about more than recovering remains. It was about giving long-waiting families the answers they had spent years hoping for. But the years passed without a breakthrough. By the late 1990s, investigators were no longer finding new victims near the Green River or at the disposal sites that had become associated with the case. The change raised a difficult question. Had the killer finally stopped? Or had he simply changed the way he committed his crimes? And where he left his victims? Meanwhile, public frustration continued to grow. Many people believed the investigation had not received the attention it deserved because so many of the victims came from vulnerable backgrounds, including sex workers, women living in poverty, drug users, and teenage runaways. Despite the criticism, local authorities and the FBI insisted they remained committed to identifying the killer and bringing the case to a close. In 2001, advances in DNA forensic technology gave investigators their first real opportunity to identify the person responsible for the Green River murders. Biological evidence collected from several victims during the 1980s was re-examined and compared with a saliva sample police had obtained nearly 20 years earlier from a man who had once been considered a suspect but was released due to a lack of evidence. The results left no room for doubt. The DNA was a match. The man was Gary Ridgway. Armed with evidence that could no longer be disputed, police arrested Gary Ridgway on the 30th of November 2001 as he was leaving work. At 52 years old, the truck painter, who had spent years living what appeared to be an ordinary life, was finally identified as the man behind the string of murders that had haunted the Seattle metropolitan area for nearly 2 decades. His arrest brought one of the longest-running serial murder investigations in American history to an end. But it also raised an even more unsettling question. Who was Gary Ridgway? How did a man who seemed so ordinary manage to live among his community for years while hiding one of the darkest secrets in the history of American crime? Gary Leon Ridgway was born on the 18th of February, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. Not long afterward, his family relocated to the SeaTac area within the Seattle metropolitan region, where Gary spent most of his childhood and teenage years. Gary was the second of 3 children born to Thomas Newton Ridgway and Mary Rita Ridgway. His father worked as a bus driver, while his mother was a homemaker known for her dominant personality. According to multiple accounts, she frequently disciplined her children through physical punishment, even for relatively minor mistakes. Years after Gary's arrest, investigators and criminal psychologists began taking a closer look at his childhood. Through interviews and psychological evaluations, they found that he had grown up in a deeply troubled household. His parents argued frequently, and the constant conflict became a part of his everyday life from an early age. As a child, Gary was known to be quiet, reserved, and socially withdrawn. In later interviews, he described his relationship with his mother as deeply complicated. Throughout his childhood and into his teenage years, Gary struggled with persistent bedwetting. Whenever it happened, his mother would scold him before bathing him and helping him clean up. According to Gary, those repeated experiences left him growing up with feelings of shame, anger, and confusion about his relationship with her. Gary also claimed that his mother often wore tight-fitting clothes and dressed in a way that drew his attention while at home. According to his own account, those experiences eventually gave rise to deeply conflicting emotions. Over time, he said he developed inappropriate sexual feelings toward his mother while, at the same time, harboring an intense resentment toward her. In one interview, Gary admitted that he had once thought about killing his mother. He insisted, however, that those thoughts were never acted upon. Meanwhile, Gary's father often complained about the sex workers he encountered along his bus route. Years later, some criminal psychologists suggested that Gary's family environment and these early experiences may have influenced the way he viewed women, particularly sex workers. Even so, they emphasized that no single factor can fully explain why someone ultimately becomes a serial killer. At school, Gary was known as a quiet student with average academic performance. He struggled with learning at times and never stood out among his classmates. But when he was around 16 years old, an incident occurred that would later be regarded as one of the earliest signs of his increasingly aggressive behavior. At around the age of 16, Gary was involved in an incident in which he attacked a 6-year-old boy who was walking alone using a knife. The child survived the assault. When later asked to explain his actions, Gary said he wanted to know what it felt like to injure another person. After undergoing a psychological evaluation, he was not given a lengthy prison sentence and eventually returned to his everyday life. After graduating from high school, Gary joined the United States Navy, where he served as a ship's technician. During his military service, he was stationed in several overseas locations, including parts of Asia. Years later, investigators learned that this was the period when Gary first became a regular customer of sex workers. After completing his service, he returned to Washington State to begin his life as a civilian. In 1970, Gary married his high school sweetheart, Claudia Kraus. The marriage lasted for about a year before ending in divorce. Several years later, in December 1973, Gary married for a second time. His wife was Marcia Lorraine Winslow, and together they had a son. Around this time, Gary began working as a truck painter at Kenworth Truck Company, a job he would keep for more than 3 decades. At work, Gary was known as a hardworking, dependable employee who rarely caused problems. But his second marriage eventually began to fall apart. Marcia filed for divorce after discovering that Gary had repeatedly visited sex workers and engaged in extramarital affairs. Their marriage ended in the early 1980s. Several years later, Gary met a woman named Judith Mawson. After dating for some time, the couple married in 1988. To Judith, Gary was a loving husband and a dedicated worker who lived what appeared to be an ordinary life. He left for work each morning, returned home on time, regularly attended church, and often spent his free time traveling with his wife or simply enjoying quiet moments together. Judith was not alone in seeing Gary that way. His neighbors and coworkers also knew him as a quiet, friendly man. No one imagined that behind his seemingly ordinary life, he was hiding a secret that had gone unnoticed for years. It was not until Gary Ridgway's arrest on the 30th of November 2001, based on DNA evidence, that Judith learned who the man she had been living with really was. What made the truth even more devastating was that some of Gary's murders had been committed while they were husband and wife. For years, Judith had shared her life with one of the most notorious serial killers in American history without ever knowing it. After his arrest in late November 2001, Gary Ridgway continued to deny every allegation against him. He insisted he had nothing to do with the series of murders that had haunted the Seattle metropolitan area for nearly 2 decades. But this time, the investigation was very different. The DNA evidence investigators had obtained was far stronger than anything available during the 1980s, leaving them confident that they had finally identified the man they had been searching for. Over the following months, detectives continued questioning Gary while carefully assembling the evidence against him. At the same time, prosecutors faced a difficult dilemma. They believed Gary was responsible for far more victims than they could prove in court. If he chose to remain silent, many families might never learn what had happened to their loved ones or where their remains had been left. For that reason, in June 2003, prosecutors offered Gary a plea agreement. In exchange for the death penalty being taken off the table, he agreed to plead guilty and provide a full, truthful account of every murder he had committed in King County. He also agreed to cooperate with investigators by identifying the locations where he had disposed of his victims and answering every question throughout the investigation. During a series of interviews following his agreement with prosecutors, Gary Ridgway finally began describing in detail how he had carried out the murders. As he spoke, investigators realized the crimes had never been acts of impulse. Instead, they followed a method that Gary had repeated over many years. Gary explained that he typically approached his victims in a calm and friendly manner. He worked to gain their trust by presenting himself as an ordinary man and a respectable family man before driving them to secluded locations. There, he sexually assaulted them before killing them by strangulation, using either his hands or whatever was readily available, including rope or the victim's own clothing.
How much are you pulling on her neck?
I'm pulling really hard on her neck.
How?
Just like this.
What are you saying to her?
Don't fight, and I'll let you go. I'm feeling, I gotta kill her, I gotta kill her, I gotta kill her.
Gary also admitted that he had taken steps to reduce the chances of leaving behind evidence. He often wore gloves to avoid leaving fingerprints and routinely prepared explanations for injuries he received while victims fought back. On one occasion, he deliberately poured battery acid on his arm so that scratch marks would appear to be burns caused by a workplace accident. To help carry out the murders, Gary modified the back of the truck he drove every day, creating an enclosed space where he could transport victims without easily attracting attention. Gary also told investigators that some victims had been buried in shallow graves, while others were left in open areas. During the interviews, he admitted that he sometimes returned to certain disposal sites after leaving the bodies there. That admission provided investigators with further evidence of the sexual deviance that had become part of his pattern of offending. As part of his cooperation with investigators, Gary agreed to lead them to a number of locations where he had disposed of his victims' bodies. Based on the information he provided, investigators were able to recover and identify the remains of several victims who had never been found. The number of confirmed victims eventually rose to 49. One of the most surprising revelations, however, came from Gary himself. He admitted that he could no longer remember exactly how many women he had killed or where all of their bodies had been left. On several occasions, Gary claimed the true number of victims might have been as high as 70 to 80, although most of those additional murders could never be confirmed. After reviewing the evidence, Gary's confessions, and the findings of multiple psychological evaluations, investigators and criminal psychologists concluded that no single factor could fully explain how Gary Ridgway became a serial killer. Instead, they believed his behavior was likely shaped by a combination of influences that developed over many years, including a childhood marked by family conflict, complicated relationships with his parents, sexual deviance that emerged at an early age, and a long-standing pattern of escalating violence. One fact, however, became unmistakably clear. Gary did not choose his victims at random. Time and again, he targeted women and teenage girls living in vulnerable circumstances, runaways, women struggling with drug addiction, those living in poverty, and sex workers, because he believed they were easier to approach, easier to control, and less likely to be reported missing right away. On the 18th of December 2003, Gary Ridgway was sentenced in the King County Superior Court in Washington to 48 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The sentence was part of the agreement he had reached with prosecutors, allowing him to avoid the death penalty in exchange for his guilty plea and his continued cooperation in helping investigators locate victims who had not yet been found. Today, Gary Ridgway remains incarcerated at the Washington State Penitentiary in Walla Walla. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars, with no possibility of release. For many of the victims' families, however, the sentence never truly brought an end to their suffering. Some finally learned what had happened to the people they had spent years searching for. Others were left to accept that not every question would ever be answered. In the end, what made Gary Ridgway so disturbing was not simply the number of his victims. It was his ability to live what appeared to be an ordinary life while concealing one of the darkest secrets in American criminal history. For nearly 2 decades, he went to work, raised a family, lived among his neighbors, and repeatedly escaped suspicion. Only when advances in forensic science finally caught up with the evidence that had remained hidden for years was his true identity revealed. To the world, Gary Ridgway became known as the Green River Killer. But to many of the people who had known him, he was simply an ordinary man. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of this entire story.